Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the BFG Podcast. Today we are honoured and privileged to have the CEO of the ALeague, Danny Townsend, on the program. Good morning, Danny.
Hey Blake, how are
Good
you?
to have you this morning.
No, thanks for inviting me on. Look forward to the chat.
Did you see the game for the Phoenix on the weekend?
Yeah, it was a big day. It's a big day in Wellington. The girls got it done for the first time, which was awesome. They probably hadn't had a lot of luck in some of the games I saw, and it was nice to see it come together emphatically. So huge win for them.
So how much of a asset have they been to the league since they joined for you guys?
Yeah, look, I think it's been great. You know, obviously challenging in the first year for them to be away from home. That wasn't the greatest introduction, and they were put together really quickly. You know, when we made the decision to bring the Knicks into the A-League women, we all did so knowing that it was going to be challenging to put together a team quickly, particularly given a lot of the best Kiwi players were already playing for other A-League teams. So, I think in the first season with all that adversity, they really, they gave a great account of themselves. And this year being settled back in, I think it has been difficult for them, but certainly they're showing signs of improvement, and that win was a great one. Hopefully sets them on a roll now. But it's been great to have them in the competition. I think APL has been pretty clear from the beginning. Our commitment to women's football is significant, and it was important for us to close the loop on having a New Zealand team represented in the A-League women, and obviously it made perfect sense with the Women's World Cup on our doorstep. So, yeah, they've been great.
Thank you. And hand over to one of you ladies for another question.
I'll jump in. Yeah, the Phoenix have been great, super positive. It's been a really inspiring team, even though they haven't been winning. But one of the things that the fans we get a little grumbly about was there's kind of this structural thing where you have to give up a Kiwi player to get an international. And, with the likes of Jess McDonald, Madison Haley, some of these athletes really come in and make a difference for a team. And, we would have to give up a Kiwi to get an international. So it's a really tricky thing that we're, kind of in a pickle about. A lot of the fans would like to see that changed. What's your response?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting one. We've always grappled with that on the men's side of things as well, right? Having, the treatment of Kiwi players in the league, particularly playing for Australian teams and being considered foreigners. And I do think it needs to be reviewed moving forward across the board because, if we're genuinely committing to an Australasian league, and this is not Kiwi teams playing in an Australian league, which is sort of sometimes how it's treated and perceived, which I'm not a big fan of. And I think we've got to move in a direction whereby we treat Kiwis and Australian players similarly, and we don't do that at the moment. Now, I don't know the exact answer to that and what the right balance is because there's other stakeholders that we need to manage, i.e. the New Zealand Federation, who've got their own reasons for wanting the team to succeed, and theirs is predominantly about developing Kiwi talent. So bringing in foreigners in the place of a Kiwi player has obviously complications for New Zealand Federation. And equally, you have the Football Australia who've got their own ambitions for the development of the league. So I think it's that fine balance of just going down a path that makes sense and gives every team the opportunity to be successful, but equally benefit from the likes of playing with the Madison Haleys of the world, the Jess McDonalds, for young aspiring Kiwi players to play with foreigners like that. I think is also a positive into their development. So I think, look, I don't have the answer right now, Denise, but it's certainly something that in time needs to be managed and adjusted in a sensible way.
Holly?
So I wanted to jump in a little bit about women's football as well. So there was a decision to merge the W League and the A League into the same brand identity. And that sort of had mixed reviews from dub fans, from women's football fans. And we're wondering how that transition has gone and whether the APL has been an improvement for women's football, this new system, or does anything need to change?
No, look, I don't think so. I think it's early days and change often takes time to really bed down. I think what's been really important with that is from a broader stakeholder group, it's been applauded across different sports in different minority groups around the inclusiveness of what football is about, particularly some of the changes that APL have made to drive into that real inherent strength we have, which is we are the most inclusive sport, and obviously being underpinned by our multicultural heritage and all those things that are inherent strengths for our game. I think APL is, I'd like to think at least, the commitment we've made to expanding both the competition in terms of the number of clubs and also things like introducing the club championship, where we're trying to put more value on points in the A-League women competition for clubs, trying to drive that cross-pollination of fan base from the men's team into the women's team. I think we were probably a little bit surprised at how the rusted-on Dub fans sort of reacted, because our intention was to drive more attention to the women's game and by making that change, and equally trying to broaden out the fan base, so it's just not the rusted ons every year banging on in support of women's football. It's taking advantage of that huge foundational strength we have in the fact that it is a genuinely gender agnostic sport. The women's participation at a grassroots level is growing, in Australia and New Zealand significantly, and I think the introduction of new clubs, but also, and probably more importantly, the extension of the season, I think is something that would only have happened under APL leadership, and it's we've only been at the helm for, call it whatever it has been, just over a year really, and I think the changes we've made are pretty clear around how we view the women's game.
So it does seem like it's one of the campaigns has been to extend the season in the Dub, and that has slowly been happening. One of the new sort of campaigns or hashtags that has come out is balance the board. Do you think that in the leadership and the decision-making process in the APL needs to be have more diversity or needs to be changed?
Look, I don't think it needs to be changed necessarily, but I do think we should be driving to have the most diverse representation on our board, and having Ebru Coxall join the board recently has been amazing. Like she's such a fantastic woman, but such a great football person fundamentally, and her knowledge, not just on women's football, but just in business in general. She's got a huge amount of experience across just business as well as football. So I've noticed a marked change on our board dynamic having Ebru involved, and as we search for our independent chair and the final independent slot, we'll certainly be looking to try and find a diverse balance there. But in terms of the governance model, like we're in a transition period. The New Leagues Working Group of the FA Congress that pushed and supported the unbundling had a very clear transition process around how that board would be composed initially, and then what it would move to over the course of time. And that is to evolve it to a 9-person board. Obviously, it will always have a majority representation of the clubs, because that's the reason that we unbundled, was to give the clubs a bit more, I suppose, power or control over their own destiny. So I think it's heading down that path. We'd actually briefed an exec search firm in the back quarter of last year to begin the process for the independent chair. And that process is ongoing, and we want to make sure we find the right person to lead that board.
Thank you. So one of the elephants in the room for the A-Leagues at the moment is the recent selling of the hosting rights of the grand finals to Destination New South Wales. Obviously, we all know this has been a little bit controversial. There's a sense that it maybe has damaged the relationship between the APL and fans. What steps have been taken to improve this relationship?
Yeah, you're right in summary there, Holly. I think, we certainly learnt a lot through that process around how we execute some of these difficult things, and change is difficult. We just talked about it with the branding of the competitions, and this was always going to be one that was going to require, careful management. And unfortunately, it didn't play out that way, as the clubs and stakeholders just didn't come together the way they intended to. And there was a pretty clear plan around that communication, and it didn't get executed well. But, what I'm, I think in my time at Sydney FC, I was always a very open leader of that club, and was always engaging fans on trying to to ascertain their views on certain matters. And we'd already had in place a plan to build a fan council or fan committee before that announcement was made, but it hadn't actually eventuated. And in the meetings that I've had since then, I've had 7 club supporter meetings like I had with the Knicks. I've had a representation of the active group, 11 of the clubs represented on that committee, which, we're all very similar conversations. I think everyone wants the same thing. Everyone wants our game to grow. Everyone wants football to be the number one sport in Australia and New Zealand. And to do that, you've got to make decisions that may often feel like they're not respecting the fans, but what they're designed to do is actually deliver an overall long-term strategy that does enable us as a sport to get where we need to get to. So I think those meetings were really helpful for me. I think it was, from the feedback I got from each of the clubs, supporter groups, was helpful for them to get that direct communication and ask those questions that they wanted to ask. And I think similarly to this sort of situation, it's about just being truthful around the way it played out. Yes, we could have done it better. Were the reasons that we did it the right ones? I still believe they are, because it's about driving more investment in our game. We're not going to be able to match it with the AFLs, the NRLs, and the Super Rugbies if we're not commercially viable. And it was sort of construed that we necessarily needed the money to survive. I wouldn't suggest it was survival mechanism. It was more about raising more income that will enable us to distribute more to clubs. At the end of the day, we want to pay out as much money as we can to our clubs, because that means they can invest more in their own club and the product that they serve their fans with. So there's never going to be enough money, right? Because we can always do with more money, but there are certain things that you've got to commercialise and certain things you can't, and the league has limited things that it can commercialise. So yeah, look, I think we're very much committed to working with fans. We made some commitments, particularly in the active supporter group, around moving our governance into a position where we've got the independents on the board, ensuring we build that fan council by the end of this season, by working with our clubs and our travel partners to ensure there's great opportunities for fans to get there in an affordable and efficient way. So yeah, we made a bunch of commitments in those meetings that we'll certainly see through.
Hey, Blake.
Sorry, I did say I was just going to follow up. So it did sound like you guys were going to resell the grand final after 3 years. Is there still a plan to do that? How is the consultation going to work? Fans are giving genuine feedback. How does that work in that decision making? Does the APL potentially admit they got it wrong, I suppose I could say, and how does that work?
No, we certainly I don't think we got it wrong from the reasons why we did it. They all exist and are very real. And I've had the opportunity to explain those to the fans in those meetings. I think we certainly got the execution wrong in terms of the way it was communicated and the way it played out. But there are some practical realities of doing commercial deals, and confidentiality is a really important one, particularly with governments. And that was something that made it difficult to more broadly test things out. But I think moving into the next period, and we made this commitment as well to the supporter groups, that we would sit down before the end of that 3 years and review it and see how it goes. I think we all want it to be successful ultimately, because if we've got a flagship matches inside a festival of football that are compelling for sports fans to get behind, not just football fans, but we want this to be something that sports fans put on their bucket list to go and see, like an AFL grand final is for an Australian sports fan. So, we want it to be successful. We'll see what happens over the first 3 years, but we have made a commitment that before we move into the next phase, we will certainly sit with the fan council and work through the pros and the cons, what worked, what hasn't worked. Do we proceed? Do we not? I'd like to think that it's a $15 million proposition now, that it might be a $30 million proposition in 3 years, and the monies that we're generating are flowing back into the game for us to continue to chip away at those other codes so we can get to that number one slot.
Because of the financial aspects, so it feels like recently there was a lot of discussion about targeting really high-profile, expensive marquees and talking about the Silver Lake investment. And now we're talking about, we're going to get all this money for selling the grand finals. were we mistaken about how much money there was for the APL? And if not, where has this money gone from Silver Lake?
Yeah, look, I've sort of touched on this before, but Silver Lake money was not, we didn't raise capital to keep the lights on, right? We raised capital to change the commercial paradigm that would allow us to invest in things that the game just didn't have. We have fundamentals of unbundling. We didn't have any digital assets at all. We had to build those from scratch, which is, if you know anything about building a digital ecosystem, it's not cheap. So we had to build all those things out, and the Keep Up network is very much nascent in its stage. We've got really big ambitions for that, and all those ambitions take money. Building out the fantasy and tipping costs money to build those things, and so we've certainly there was some rhetoric around there that the money's gone. The money has not gone. The money has been invested into things. We've got a lot of that money still left to ingest into the business over the next 3 years for growth. But we also can't ignore, we went through COVID in that period. We raised capital and then we got hit with COVID. And as you can probably guess, keeping the Wellington Phoenix in New South Wales for essentially 2 or 3 seasons is not cheap. Having Perth located outside of their state for a full season is not cheap. You know, to fly people around, reschedule matches, like it was a financial challenge to get through all that. Fortunately, we were well capitalized to work through it and support the clubs that were probably more let's say influenced by the COVID pandemic. But we've still got significant funds to continue to invest in the growth of the game, but we don't want those funds to be drained out of the bottom without having them impact the growth of the sport, because I think we all agree, what we inherited after unbundling was not a financially sustainable proposition, and we need it to be, because if we're going to expect our owners to continue to invest, we need to do that in a sustainable economic environment, and we think we can do that. You're only going to get there by growth initiatives, not the opposite. So,
thank you. Blake has the next question.
Thank you. So we touched on this in the closed door meetings a little bit, but can you just tell the general public, how do you intend to continue to make the grand final inclusive for all? So meaning people like me who are disabled, elderly people, so that they can travel to the grand final if they live outside of the proposed date or live outside of the country, like in my case, or maybe a few of my friends' cases.
Yeah, look, certainly we've got to work really, really hard, and we're committed to doing that to ensure it's as accessible to everyone as possible. I think one of the other things that was lost in the communication was the introduction of the home and away semi-finals, and we did that last year knowing we were going down this path to ensure that if you finish in those last 4 slots, you're going to get to see your team at home. And that wasn't always the case. You could actually make it through to a grand final and never play at home in the final series if you finished 5th or 6th. So we were conscious that we wanted to ensure that if you were going all the way, then your fans got at least one opportunity to see your team play, and that's why the home and away semi-finals were introduced. When we introduced them, we couldn't really explain why we did that to point to the grand final because it was all premature. But the strategy was about ensuring we got that. So there's absolutely going to be an opportunity for every fan to see their club play if they make it to the grand final. And then the jobs between the clubs and the league to get in and work with our partners to ensure that access is firstly possible, but secondly affordable and practical. And I think that's the work that's already begun. We've announced a deal with IHG Hotels that are coming to the party with packages. We're working with our airline partners. Government have got a huge amount of influence over the travel industry, and they've committed to dig in to lean on them to ensure they support club supporters from outside of New South Wales. And the other one as well is we've also put 2 weeks between the last semi-final and the grand final. If you think typically you've got one set of fans having 6 days to organise travel, there's typically no package available because 6 days is too small a run to arrange those sort of things. So we've got 2 weeks. We'll know who the 2 clubs are, and then we'll work really closely with those clubs to put into action the packages we've already got or continue to refine them to ensure we get as many travelling fans there as we can. Because as we know, grand final spectacles are all about colours and the noise that the fans make supporting their club. So I don't think we're keen to see a neutral set of fans sitting in a stadium. That's not what football's about.
I'm one of the rare birds that actually supports a place for the finals. I've seen it happen in the NWSL, and it becomes the biggest party and the biggest celebration in the league. I mean, how are you going to make this one fun for the women in particular? You know,
absolutely.
To be the afterthought, because we're awesome and love to like really hit this hard. And yeah,
it's really good.
Well, or
yeah, it's a really important point. I think is part of the rationale for this was about how we make the women's grand final a spectacle. And I take it back to my time at Sydney when Sydney FC had, I think, 7 starting Matildas and played Perth Glory, who had Sam Kerr in an A-League, well, W League grand final as it was called then, and each team had 5 or 6 American stars. You know, Sophia Huerta was playing at Sydney, who's now in the US team. Aubrey Bledsoe, Emily Sonnet. Like these girls went on to play for the US national team now. So these are high caliber footballers, and I think there was 4,000 people there because we had 5 days to arrange it from the semi-final the week before. Now this time we're actually in the meetings this week with Destination New South Wales on the launch of the women's grand final, because we've now got, I think it's 100 days until the grand final that we can really get in behind and build an event around this, work with the local New South Wales Federation around getting young female registered participants access to that grand final. What are we doing around it in terms of putting on other football related events? It's going to be easier next year when the women's grand final is closer to the men's grand final with that extended season. This year's a bit of an outlier, so we're treating it as a real standalone opportunity for us to get behind the women's grand final, particularly with the Women's World Cup, shortly after that, starting in Australia, New Zealand. So, yeah, we think that we could break all records. Just whoever's in that grand final, I don't think it will matter. It's just going to be about celebrating women's football, and we can't do that when we had 6 days' notice like we did previously.
So moving on to another topic, I think there's a considerable amount of concern about player welfare in the leagues regarding the heat, with fixtures scheduled earlier in the day. This had some run-on consequences, at worst players collapsing in the heat, at best matches being rescheduled at very late notice. What does the APL plan to do to minimise this risk?
Yeah, look, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, I think, Ollie. We want to play games at family-friendly hours, and traditionally with our Foxtel agreement, we had to play in certain slots because they were filling a broadcast schedule. We don't have that necessarily now with our relationship with the way it's structured with 10 and Paramount. There are a couple of slots that are locked, but the majority of them are really at our discretion. And we consulted clubs at the beginning of the year and said, what times would you prefer kickoff? And all of them would like them early. Now, obviously, we're a summer sport, so with that comes a trade-off. And I think we've got a very conservative heat policy. If you look at ours, if you went and checked FIFA and the AFC's regulations, we're actually on the conservative side. So we're always got the player welfare in mind. The PFA have worked with us on that policy. They've consulted the players on that policy, and that policy kicks into gear when certain heat thresholds are met, whether that be through drinks breaks or just postponements of matches if they need to be. It's not ideal because obviously giving fans notice that a game that was going to kick off at 3 is now kicking off at 5 is often disruptive to people's planning. But I think you've got to be sensible about these things. We want to play at family-friendly hours. In January and February, that's challenging. But you just got to be prepared to be nimble and make decisions that don't compromise the health and well-being of the players, but ensure we continue to get games away at times when families can go and not have to eat into sleep time and those things for young kids. Because ultimately for us, we're a young sport. We're the number one sport in Australia and New Zealand for under 35s. Just by definition, that cohort are going to have young families, and we need to make sure we kick off at family-friendly times. But like I said, it's finding a balance, and I think we've got that balance. It becomes acute in January. In February, we had games last weekend or this weekend. I think that the Sunday 3:00 kickoff, it's going to be 22 degrees, and you don't have to worry about it. But certainly, when it gets hot, we need to be sensible.
So, on to the next question. It feels like Australian football really failed to take advantage of the wonderful Socceroos World Cup run. We understand that there are a lot of stakeholders and a lot of factors in this matter, but how does the APL envisage on building upon this presumable success of the upcoming co-hosted Women's World Cup? How can football in Australasia really effectively leverage the attention that that will be accompanied by this event?
Yeah. I think there is a bit of a misnomer really around the national team's performance and suddenly crowds filling stadiums. It's I could point to 10 case studies around the world where that's never happened. The Women's World Cup in the US was a great example of that. They had an amazing World Cup, and then the same players were playing in the NWSL the next week in front of 1,000 people. So, I don't think there is this direct correlation between national team success and then suddenly stadiums being filled, because, Patriots follow their national team in whatever they're doing. And what you saw in live sites across Australia during the Socceroos run in the World Cup, they weren't all football fans. They were Australians who just love Australia performing on the world stage and performing well. Now, it's an opportunity for us to convert those into A-League fans, and we'll continue to try and do that. But I think there's just not an automatic sort of success that connects those two things. I think what is important, though, with the Women's World Cup, it's going to be different, because I think that is, when you've got it on home soil, it will absolutely connect more females, particularly with football. I think we currently underestimate the impact it's going to have on both our countries. It's going to be enormous. And when we made a decision to bring Wellington Phoenix in two years ago, we did that because we didn't want to wait for the Women's World Cup to come and go. We wanted to build ahead of it. That's why we brought Western United in this year. It's why we're bringing in Central Coast next year. We wanted a sustained commitment to women's football before it, because then we've got the building blocks in place to capitalise when this thing washes over the top of us and allows us to grow out the back of that. It's a bit like you look at tennis racket sales in Australia go through the roof in January, because people go, oh, look, I love tennis. I'm going to go get back into it, or I'm going to take it up. And I think that's the opportunity the Women's World Cup will bring. It'll put everyone's focus on football. Young females that may not be playing might go get a pair of boots and a ball. Female fans and even male fans, I think you'll see a huge amount of males probably sit up and take more notice of women's football as a result of the Women's World Cup, which is, again, part of that strategy that we've had in place around building a club championship, rebranding so they're on equal footing from a brand perspective, investing in extensions of seasons, more matches, more clubs. Yeah, that strategy is well in train, and we expect that to bear fruit coming out of the World Cup.
Could I just follow up a little bit? Half of the women's game fans are men, and they're used to a certain broadcast quality. I think one of the reasons why, after these World Cups, they didn't get the turnout or the eyes on the leagues is literally, it looked like a high school game. I know this year the NWSL is putting in 6 cameras. We're putting in VAR. It's going to look better. How much do you think broadcast quality sort of affects fandom?
Yeah, I think it has an impact, certainly. And I think, why one of the reasons why we really pushed hard on Channel 10 and Paramount to put every game in front of the paywall was access. If you think back a couple of years ago, I think there were 2 W League matches broadcast a week. So 3 or 4 going on that no one even saw. So, we made a commitment to the Professional Women's Football Committee back 4 years ago, was to the players, their view was we want over expansion and extension of the season. The number one thing players wanted was for their games to be accessible on television. So that was the first step for us to commit to getting every game on television. And then you start to build out the quality of that production over time. It's equally how you produce it, not necessarily from the number of cameras, is what you put around it. We launched Dub Zone this year purely because we wanted to try something different and start to broadcast women's football a different way. Because I've got 2 daughters. They don't watch football the way I watch it. They don't want to hear from a guy in a suit standing behind a desk talking about stats. They just don't. They want to hear about the player. They want to get behind the kid's journey into being a teenage football prodigy into A-League women's player. So Dub Zone was all about that. It was just trying to change up the way in which we broadcast it, and that's going to take time to bed down and that brand to grow and all those things. But I certainly think broadcast is important. We took control of broadcast on this new deal with Channel 10, largely so we could be flexible in dialing up and dialing down the cameras. The reality is it's expensive, really expensive. Like to broadcast a 10 camera coverage is you're talking $50,000 or $60,000 per game. Now, if you think about where the funds are best spent, whether you go with 10 cameras or 6 cameras or 3 cameras, and if you think about what we're paying players, I'd love to be paying players more money, particularly in the women's game. So do you trade off there between ingesting more funds into salaries so they can earn a professional living, extending the season, or do you put more cameras in? I think it's just about finding that balance. But, I, for one, watched the Men's World Cup, and that VAR experience was unbelievable. Like it changed my views on VAR. And I think if you think back, I don't remember having really one conversation with a mate of mine about a VAR decision in the World Cup, because it was so clear and the decision-making process was so transparent. The technology was amazing. So we don't have that, but that also comes at a significant cost. So it's about just sort of edging yourself further. And and that's why commercial income is really important to the game, because it allows us to ingest that into all those things that we need for the game to improve.
On a related note to broadcasting, the Paramount Plus keep promising some upgrades to the experience, particularly the pause and the rewind and the start match from scratch. What's the ETA for that, and why haven't we? Are we charging Paramount Plus some sort of penalty, or what's going on to make that happen? Because people are pretty angry about it, to be fair.
Yeah, I think, look, we're working with Paramount here in Australia to try and speed that up. They've made commitments that they're on that path. Look, one of the strengths and weaknesses of dealing with a global company is that you've got the security of being part of one of the biggest media conglomerates in the world. You're also, on the flip side, a small country in a global business that doesn't necessarily get the attention that it might otherwise want. So, look, I know Jared Villani and Bev McGarvey, the 2 co-CEOs of Paramount, they are banging the table hard to get this resolved. So it's not like they're not listening or ignoring it. So they absolutely they don't want people to have a second an experience on their platform that is not optimized. They know that. They want it to be optimized. They're working on it. I believe it's not far away, but I can't really comment on their product pipeline. But I can reassure you that we're leaning in hard and have been for 18 months now with them to make it clear on our expectation. And I know that they've been very, very clear with their powers that be that they need this resolved. And I'm confident it will relatively soon.
Okay, thank you. Back to sort of the player welfare topic. So industrial relations have been between footballers and the governing bodies in Australia a little bit strained in the past. How would you characterise the APL's relationships with players at the moment? What role does the Professional Footballers Association Australia, the union, play in the decision-making process related to matters of players' working environment, pay and conditions?
Yeah, look, I first would say is that our relationship with the PFA, I don't think has ever been better. I think having done a bunch of CBAs over my time as either a representative club CEO on that CBA working group or in my role now, COVID was a really interesting time for us all. And I think when you're up against the wall, you work out that you're much stronger together. And I think that's certainly was one of the positives coming out of COVID. I do think we went into COVID with a really good relationship, but I think it strengthened over that time because the players realised that everyone has got a role to play, and they took pay cuts like everyone else did during that period of time. We reset a long-term CBA for men and women that for the men was certainly about reduction in wages. They knew that they had to take a hit like everyone did, but we also for the first time I opened up our books to them. I said, here are the financials of the sport. We need to work together to grow them, because if we can grow them, our ability to pay you more money, both men and women, becomes real. If our sport is shrinking, then there's only one inevitable outcome there for players. They're going to earn less. And that's not what we want. We want players earning more money and being able to have Australia and New Zealand be an attractive place for professionals to play football. That comes with the conditions you put around their employment, the facilities or their treatment, when and where you fly them, where you put them up in what hotels, what sort of food you feed them. So all those things are important as well in being an attractive proposition for a footballer to come and play here. So I think we're in a really good place with them. They are partners in it. We have a ratchet in the men's CBA that if we hit certain revenue numbers, then the cap goes up and therefore they get more money, which again is the first for our sport. And having the players aligned to the objectives of the league is really important. I think the women's CBA we did was fantastic in terms of minimum standards. If you look at the minimum wage, it's been going up quite substantially over the last couple of years. It's still not where it needs to be. We admit that it's got to grow. We need female players to get to a point where they can call themselves truly professional and not have to supplement their football wage with another wage. Either be that through playing 2 competitions in 1 year, like a lot of them do, or getting a second job, which again is not something that we want to have into the future. We want these players to be fully professional, but that's going to take time. It's going to take investment and all those things, but we're certainly committed to getting there.
I think Denise has the next questions.
Sure. So what women's leagues around the world are doing it right? Like, what are you looking to as models? And, as a little follow-up, there are 13 Aussies playing in the FAWSL. And how do you feel about that?
Let's deal with that one first. I'll come back to the other one. Look, I feel great about that. I think at the end of the day, Australia will always have its place in the international football pyramid. I think we were a first mover, really, with the W League then and the ALeague women's now. So if you ask a lot of the players that have gone abroad, many of whom have come back, like a Chloe Lagazo, who's gone twice now. She went to Norway earlier on in her career. The stories she told me when she came back to Sydney about that experience compared to the experience in the A-League women, and then went off to the FA Women's Super League and also had a similar experience with a club that wasn't one of the big clubs. So she then ended up going back into the NWSL with Kansas. So she's jumped around a bit, and she can. I won't speak on her behalf, but I'm sure she'll tell you if asked, is that the standard of the A-League women and what the A-League clubs, APL clubs provide for those players is on balance far better than what you get overseas. Because if you're at a big club, absolutely you get well looked after and it's great. But if you go across the Serie A or into other leagues like the Eredivisie, the standards are pretty poor, and ours are right up there with the big leagues in the world, and that's something we should be proud of. Invariably, I went through it with Caitlin Ford. She was at Sydney FC in mid-season. She was under contract, and she rang me and she said, "Danny, Arsenal have called. They want me to come play for them." And I'm like, "Well, you're under contract." And she's like, "But it's Arsenal." And I'm like, "Yeah, it is Arsenal, right?" At the end of the day, you want to see players, male or female, progress to play in the biggest leagues in the world for the biggest clubs in the world. We should be proud of that. We shouldn't try and stop them. We should enable that. And I don't think as a sport we celebrate that enough. We often look at it as a negative. But do you know what? If I've sort of put it out there in our football strategy, we need to create players or develop players for our men's and women's national teams so to be successful as they can be. We want our clubs to be competitive in continental football competitions in the AFC. And we want our players to transfer through our pipeline and into the biggest football leagues in the world. Do I like our players going to play for a bottom 3 team in the Women's Super League? No, because I think it's not great for them. Because I know the standards that are set there aren't up to our standards. I don't think they'll develop as players. But if you look at someone like Claire Wheeler, she went into a Danish team, had an experience there, and then she's now at Everton, and that's great for her development. And we should be proud of that. I took her from Newcastle down to Sydney, and she had an internship at Macquarie Bank. She wasn't sure she could make it as a professional athlete. And the A-League women's experience enabled that. It got her into the Matildas, and then got her into a shop front window that had appealing to big football clubs like Everton. So I think, to answer the question, I love it. Do I want them to come back here? Absolutely. Would I love to see Sam Kerr, Alana Kennedy, Chloe finish their careers in Australia, like we've seen with Matt Leckie and these type of players come back in the men's competition? Absolutely. So you want to make sure that pathway back is always open. And at the right time, I'm sure they'll use that pathway, because why wouldn't you want to come back and live in Australia and New Zealand and play in an Australasian competition that's a high standard? And that's what we've got.
Well, Sam Kerr loves a good beach, so you got that.
Who doesn't? So just going back to your first question, I think, look, where do we look? We benchmark ourselves working with the PFA with all those leagues. And like I said at the start of that, we're right up there with those leagues in terms of professional standards. In fact, very much better as an average than most of them, if not all of them. I think the NWSL, I did a lot of work with them in the early days just to try and understand the dynamic that they have. It's a very different league, given they don't have the male-female connection that we have in the A-Leagues, which I don't think serves them well, to be honest. I think there's challenges with that model that mean you've got big discrepancies between ownership commitment, where you see things work really well, lots of investment into smaller clubs that don't have that same investment, and then the disparity is quite large. I think inevitably the Women's Super League will find its way. I think it's got some really great things about it. I think there's some things that they're still working on as well, being relatively new in comparison to, say, where we've been on our A-League women journey. So I don't think there's one that just stands out, frankly. I think just by nature of the brands competing in the Women's Super League in the UK, I think it's ultimately going to get there the fastest, and that will be the one that we probably lean on for for best practice in the future. But I think at the moment we're right up there.
So speaking of best practice, the NWSL there's a darker side to women's football, and some abuse by coaches, abuse in sexual nature. It's not always rainbows and chocolates. They put out 2 reports, the NWSL, about this. I think one of the biggest themes was when the players, in particular the women, fear that any negative press could collapse the league or really put a black eye on the league, that they really hesitated in coming out and talking about their experiences. And one of the things that worries me about everyone talking about the financials and the financial pressure, and is that this could be repeated in the A-League. So these 2 reports were big, important. Again, millions of bucks. I see it as free consulting for the A-League.
Absolutely, yeah.
So what do you learn from that?
Yeah, lots, I think. And what it also tells us is that the things we've put in place with the PFA around how we manage our athletes, both male and female, make those scenarios less likely to happen, but it doesn't make you immune from them. And you cannot pretend that every safeguarding measure you've got in place as a league and as a club is going to make you immune from bad behaviour. That's in reality what it is. And I think there's 2 responsibilities here, or 3. There's the PFA and the league itself. But then it's the club standards that as a league, you don't have a lot of control over. You've just got to make sure they commit to certain performance standards, which is what the CBA does. It enables us to hold them accountable. But I remember at Sydney, we had a compliance committee that really zeroed in on safeguarding and ensuring that there was opportunities for people to raise their hand and bring forward concerns. And I think that's something we've just got to be consistent with across the league and ensure that, part of the message around the finances is not about we're under threat. It's about the opportunity. How do we make this a better league? What are the things that we can do together to grow the league? So I don't want our financial, aspirations to be a negative. I think what we're saying with our sort of push for a more sustainable football economy is we want to take on the big guns. To do that, we need to make more money. So that's why decisions like the grand final are made, is because we want to be able to generate more income to reinvest in the sport. to ensure that they don't feel they're vulnerable, their employment's compromised. And COVID did that. COVID made everyone stare over the precipice of unemployment. And once you stare over the precipice of unemployment, you go, geez, I've really got to get in behind this and play my part in growing the game. But that doesn't mean you need to be silenced if things aren't right. And I think creating the environment where players feel comfortable to do that is really important. And I think that's the responsibility of the club itself, the league and the PFA to work together to ensure clubs are meeting those standards and giving their players that opportunity to come forward if things aren't right. And certainly learning from the NWSL issues. A lot of those players that were named in the Washington situation were players that had played in the A-League, who are players I know personally who are really good people. And to think that they'll compromise like that is really sad, because I know how much they love their sport and they love their club, and they want it to succeed. So to come out and feel compelled to say what they said means they clearly meant it.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of these athletes felt trapped at their club, and even if they went to their club, they felt like they couldn't get through or couldn't hear. So, I mean, my advice to you is make an open door, for that. And it's one thing to have a policy, but it's another thing to make it real. So, yeah. I mean, as a casual, very serious thing, make it real for these athletes, because you will have more buy-in, you will have more commitment, you will have less this really sucks kind of talk. Yeah. If you're super genuine around this kind of stuff, because it will happen. And two Kiwis were involved in sort of the middle of some of this. So it's not like, oh, that's the US, that's over there. Right. It is us. And so
it's all sports as well, Denise. It's not just football. And I think that's why you've got to look at the landscape you're operating in, and it comes down to the execution. At the end of the day, you, as a CEO of a club, your relationship with your players is really important. And having those players feel they can knock on your door and come in and have a chat about something that's going on in the club is really important. But as a league CEO, I can't manage that necessarily. It's up to the leadership of each club to enable that. Whether that be often not the coach, right? Because the coach is the one that picks the team, and that dynamic you talk to becomes real when a player has to go complain to a coach about something. They do feel that might compromise their ability to be picked in the starting 11 on that weekend. But, if there's a good relationship between the players and the CEO or a football director that doesn't sort of compromise that dynamic and enables things to be resolved appropriately if there are challenges, that comes down to relationships and building really strong, trusting relationships with your players. So I know that's the way I operated, and I'd like to think most CEOs of clubs or all CEOs of clubs operate that way. But yeah, it's certainly a challenge. It's a challenge in the male game as well. It's not something that's only it's sort of amplified in the female side of the game, I would say. But I can give you examples of where male players have had situations where they didn't come forward because they felt there would be implications for their career if they did, which again is just, it's not acceptable.
Thank you. Blake, do you have anything else? Holly? Just go for it.
Is there anything what is the one thing you'd like to see there? Maybe one or two things you'd like to see in the A-League improve in the time that you are CEO?
I think attendance for me, at the end of the day, the barometer for the success of your competition is bums on seats. People that love their club and turn up and commit the time and money that it takes to be a genuine fan of a football club. I think membership and attendance to me are the two metrics that are most important. There's audience on our platforms. We've invested heavily in Keep Up. We've invested heavily in the journalists. We've got over 40 people now working in Keep Up Studios who are building content and distributing it out. We want to become a media company because that serves our fans well, and that drives that flywheel of engagement into being a member, attending matches. So it's not a simple. It's simple to say. It's harder to do. We're coming out of COVID. I think we're in good shape as a league. We've got really strong foundational strengths behind us, and we're confident over time we'll get there. We wouldn't we wouldn't be doing what we're doing if we didn't believe that our sport can be the number one sport in Australia and New Zealand by 2030. That's our stated ambition. I think we're still on the path to do that. There are a bunch of things you'll start to see roll out over the next 6-12 months, which are initiatives in deploying the capital we raised. Holly, to your point, you'll start to see those, and there'll be an aha moment where people go, okay, I sort of get where these guys are going with this. We've got to hold true to our strategy, and that strategy is all about re-engaging our core fans and ensuring they're looked after through everything we do, and engaging new ones through a lot of the other content that we're trying to build in the adjacency of being a part of the world game. I think the philosophy of the A-League in the past was that is competition. The Premier League is competition. The Serie A or La Liga is competition. It's all just football. And I want football fans of the Premier League to love the A-League and vice versa. So, we were very deliberate about making sure Keep Up was a platform for all of football. And you'll see as we start to build out utility into the grassroots community football and how that's used, how Keep Up serves them in a different way as well, is all about that cross-pollination of the one thing everyone's got in common, and that is they love football. So how do we do a better job at that? And the end game of that will be more bums on seats, more people enjoying the great game and the competitions we love.
And final question before we wrap, will you commit to making the women's final top 6 like the men's competition, currently at top 4?
Yeah, I think it's inevitable, Blake. As we expand, bringing in Central Coast next year and then bring in MacArthur in time, and then as we expand both the A-League men and women competitions into the future, we see a time where there's 16 teams in the A-League women's competition, and at that time you'll certainly have a much bigger final series. When that happens will probably be something we work through, but it's certainly going to be where we end up. I think it's interesting when the part of the expansion process we're going through at the moment, notwithstanding the ingestion of the women's teams into the competition that have men's teams already, but our expansion process that we're kicking off at the moment, it's not a men's or women's expansion process. It's an APL club expansion process, and that club will need to field teams, and the men and the women, and youth competitions. So we'll see that naturally happen as we expand the competition.
Well, I just might just say thank you for coming on the program today, Danny. It's a pleasure and a privilege to have you on.
Thanks.
Thank you for answering our questions. And is there any closing comments you'd like to say? And then I'll close it off.
No, I'd just like to thank you guys. I appreciate the spirit of the conversation. Some of these topics are often tricky to manage, but I appreciate all the work you guys do to engage fans of Wellington Phoenix. And Holly, from you doing it from the other side of the ditch is probably even harder. But I just wanted to say thank you, Blake, and Denise and Holly for having me on your show.
Well, thank you for coming on, and like and subscribe this video on YouTube, and we'll see you on the next one.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.